In this exercise, we will be reading and writing data to our database. We'll implement a couple of basic queries inside of the repository class that we created previously. You'll be learning how to issue simple queries using the node-postgres driver and handling some simple failure cases, such as when a vehicle does not exist. When a query is executed as a single SQL statement, CockroachDB will automatically wrap it in a transaction. These are known as implicit transactions, and they're easier to use than explicit transactions. In this exercise, we will only be using implicit transactions. You will be able to leverage some shortcuts in the node-postgres driver and skip some of the transaction handling logic we'll see later. By the end of this exercise, you will have a working REST API that will be able to save and retrieve data from your database. Now I've gone ahead and ran my tests. First I loaded the test for the current exercise, and you can see that I've got some failing tests because it's looking for methods like add vehicle and get vehicle. And those of course don't exist yet. So that's what we're going to do in this exercise. Okay, I've opened up my vehicle repository.js and I'm going to add some methods into here. So the first one that I want to add is a get vehicle method. So we're going to actually just drop down to the bottom here after the disconnect, and we'll add an async method, and then this is going to be called get vehicle. Now it's going to take a single parameter, which will be an ID. Now, the first thing that we want to do is, it's possible that somebody might call this method before calling the connect method, in which case the pool won't be initialized and nothing's going to work. So we're going to add a little bit of error handling here. So we'll say if not this dot pool. So in other words, if the pool has not been initialized, then we want to throw an error. So we'll do throw new error, and then we need a simple error message, something like the repository is not connected to a database. Did you forget to call connect? So just a simple helper error message there. And that'll take care of the quick check. Now, the next thing we need to do is to execute the actual statement. But I'm going to actually pull the statement itself out into a variable. So this will be select statement. And the reason that I do that is just because otherwise the actual line of code for executing the statement can get kind of long and hard to read. And I want to keep it readable. So this is just going to be a simple string. And I'll do select star from vehicles where ID is equal to $1. And so $1 is going to be a parameter that I'm going to pass in. And obviously it's going to equal the ID. Now again, I could just do this in line, but it's helpful to learn this syntax because it'll be valuable later when we do some other things. So then I need to actually execute that. And so we're going to do const result is equal to, and here we'll do an await because this is going to be calling an asynchronous method. And we'll do pool dot query. And so we're actually going to the pool and we're directly executing a query on that pool. This is how we do things that use implicit transactions. If we wanted to be explicit and do an explicit transaction, the syntax we would use would be a little bit different. We'll see that a little bit later. But for now, with an implicit transaction, this will be fine. And so we'll just pass in the select statement. And then we need an array of values to substitute in for any of those dollar parameters. We only have one value here, and that's the ID. So we can just pass that in as is. So that will get substituted in here. So that's fine. And then the other thing too is that once we get back that result, we have to actually check it to see if anything came back, because it's possible there wasn't anything. So we'll do if result.row count is equal to 1. We should only get back one result because, again, we're doing a search against the primary key here, so we shouldn't ever get more than one. If we do, something has gone horribly wrong. But if we get back one result, then we need to return the vehicle. Now, I could theoretically just do something like result.rows at 0, but that's going to return an object that is more complex than what I actually want. because what I actually want is something that's a little simpler, doesn't have all the database logic attached to it, that kind of thing. And I also want to remap some field names because they're going to come out as snake case. And I want them to be camel case. And so there's a few changes that I'm going to make. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to implement a method, which we're going to call toVehicle. And I'm going to pass in that result to that method, and then I'll convert it to the format that I'm looking for. Then the final thing that I need to do is if that came up with nothing, I'll add an else statement. And so what the else statement will be is return null. Okay, let's go ahead and implement that toVehicle. I'm going to do this at the top because that's where I'm keeping all of my kind of private and protected variables and things like that. So because this is going to be a private method, I'll keep it up at the top. So this is going to be a private method called toVehicle, and it's going to take in that query result. And then what we're going to do is we're going to return a JavaScript object, which will consist of an ID. So the query result.id. Then we want a purchase date. So here's a case where I'm remapping from snake case to camel case. So it was query result.purchase date in snake case. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to convert this to an ISO string rather than keeping it as a date object. And then we want a serial number, which will be query result.serial number, again converting from snake case, and then make okay, so that should hopefully give me my toVehicle method. So now that the getVehicle is done, we need to move on and create an addVehicle method. Now, just to save myself a bit of time, I'm actually going to copy my getVehicle and then I'll paste it down below. Little bit of a formatting difference there. And then we'll do addVehicle. Now, this is going to actually take a vehicle, a full vehicle as a parameter. So we'll pass that in. We're going to leave this check logic here because that's perfectly fine as is. This won't be select statement. This will be insert statement. And it's going to be a more complicated statement. So let's just go ahead and delete that. I'm actually going to switch to a different style of quote so that I can do this as a multi-line string just because it'll be a little easier to read. Otherwise, it gets quite long. And we're going to do insert into vehicles. We want the purchase date, the serial number, and then we need a set of values. Now, one thing I will point out before I insert these values is that I didn't include the ID. And again, that's because we're going to let the database generate the ID. So we're not going to bother passing in an ID here. But then I'm going to do $1, $2. Then the other thing I want to do is I want to do returning star. And so what that's going to do is that will actually, once we insert the vehicle, it's going to return the vehicle back and it will return all of the fields, including the ID that the database just generated. And so that's key here, is that we actually get back that ID that the database generates for us. Okay, then our result is going to be a little different as well. So it's going to use the insert statement. So I'm going to copy and paste that. We don't have an ID. I'm going to multi-line this again, just for readability once more. And what we're going to do is we're going to do vehicle dot, oops, spelled that wrong. Vehicle dot purchase date. This will be camel case. And then let's just copy and paste some stuff. So I should have a total of 7 now. And so this is going to be serial number. All right, so that takes care of that. And then just going a little further down on the list here. So this code is actually fine as is. So we're going to check that we get back a result, meaning that the object has been inserted and it was returned. And then we're going to call the toVehicle method, and we're going to call it exactly as we did before. We don't have to make any changes to what we did before. And otherwise, we're going to return null. So this is fine as is, which means that we're done with the getVehicle and addVehicle. Okay, the next thing that we need to do is we're going to jump into our vehicle controller. And we're just going to scroll down, and you'll see where we've got this return not yet implemented on the getVehicle, and then we have something very similar on the addVehicle. So that's where we need to modify and just actually call those methods. So what's that going to look like? This will be very simple. So it'll just be return this, and we have access to a repository. So we're going to return the repository.getVehicle, and we're passing in the ID that we got. Then I can get rid of this. Then down below, something very similar. It's just going to be return this repository.addVehicle. And in this case, we're passing in the request object, and the request object will be the actual vehicle. Over in my terminal, you can see that I've executed my tests, and it looks like they all passed. So it looks like I've done everything correctly. And now I can actually switch to manually testing the API. Okay, back over in my terminal here. Now I'm going to actually run the application. So I'm going to do node app.js. Now I only have access to one terminal here, which means if I run this, I'm not going to necessarily be able to actually test against it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually background it. So I will run this in the background, and that way I can still continue to test here. So we give you an example of a curl statement that you can execute. So I'm going to go ahead and execute that. And you can see it looks like it did something. I got back an ID. So this is the actual object that was inserted. Looks like that was successful. And so now what I can do is I can actually do a curl to get that back. So here we just need to replace this UUID. So again, let's just copy and paste that with the UUID that came back. And let's see if that works. Looks like, yes, it works. So when I did the getVehicle, I got something back from it. So it appears that everything is working as expected. One thing I did just notice is I've got an error in a log statement here. So it's update vehicle. That should have been getVehicle. So I can fix that just by going back over to my controller. And it looks like the problem is right here. So I should just change this to get, and then that'll take care of everything. I won't bother showing you that. I'm sure you can figure out what that'll do on its own. But in the meantime, I think we're ready to move on to the next exercise.